Greetings from Sun City, Arizona, to Spencer and his cat. Beautiful cat. Look at that tail. I was going to talk about Robert's transcript number 148, which I recommended that everybody read. Because it talks about the final truth of Advaita, the going beyond even nirvana. Although the concept of nirvana speaks of the same thing. But I had the pleasure of just completing reading Swami Shankarananda's spiritual autobiography, at least through 1980. Swami Shankarananda are friends. We've been friends since 1978. I had just left Zen at that time because Zen was really cold. There's very little love, very little emotion in Zen. So I left Zen and wandered by his ashram, which was located quite close to where I lived. One day, I entered his ashram in Los Angeles and was subject to the most beautiful chanting I've ever heard. The drummer was Swami Shankarananda, and Devi, his significant other, was playing the harmonium. I believe it was Devi. Things changed over the years, but he and I hit it off. I loved Shankarananda. Even then I loved him. There was a sweetness about his satsangs that was unsurpassable. Over the years we got to be good friends. He moved to Los Angeles for a time after Baba Muktananda died and started another ashram here. And he left after a few years, but during those 2 or 3 years it was very interesting. We hung out with Nityananda, one of Muktananda's successors, Shankarananda and myself, and it was very interesting times during the battle between Nityananda and his sister for control of Siddha Yoga. But these are very radically different paths. Siddha Yoga is a radically different path. Kashmir Shaivism is a radically different path from that of Advaita. Last week I talked very strongly about the explosion of the divine within one. And it happened to me through love of a woman. But that explosion of bliss within oneself, that explosion of feeling the life force within oneself, that explosion of consciousness and of the energies within oneself, that's called Shaktipat. It's usually bestowed by a guru. And in my case, it happened spontaneously with a woman. And that's why I've talked about it so many times, because Shaktipat can come out of anywhere. It can come as a complete surprise. It can come whenever a person is ready. Now, Shankarananda and I were born 4 days apart in 1942. We were born about 400 miles apart. We started our spiritual training at approximately the same time. I started in 1968. He started in 1970. The difference was I chose Zen and he chose Siddha Yoga. Back in 1968, I went to Philip Kapleau's Zen Center in Rochester, New York. And in 1970, Shankarananda went to India looking for a guru. He had been influenced by Ram Dass and others that were coming out of India, Westerners, talking about India and their Indian gurus, from Neem Karol Baba to Muktananda to Nityananda. And so he and his wife, Gurujananda, traveled together through Europe, Turkey, and into India, where they went to Ganesh Puri and stayed with Muktananda for 3 years. Both, well, I should say, Shankarananda had a Shaktipat relatively early in his spiritual life, probably in the early 70s while he was at Ganesh Puri, while I didn't have Shaktipat until 2009. However, I had a different kind of awakening experience with Robert in 1995. And it's very different from the kinds of experience that Shankarananda had or has. Siddha Yoga, the Kundalini yogis, the chakra yogis have very different spiritual paths than those in Advaita or those who practice Samkhya, which is the Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga of Patanjali. In 1995, I realized the personal self didn't exist, and you might say attained unity consciousness because there was no center there anymore of I versus thou. It was a non-I state, and all consciousness was one. For Shankarananda, the first experience was one of utter bliss and peace, and an explosion of bliss that continued. The feeling of Shakti, the recognition of Shakti. For me, that didn't happen until, 20-some years later. 30-some years. Different paths. And the timing and the phenomena on the different paths are different. If you read Robert and you read Ramana, you never hear about Shaktipat. You never hear about the awakening of Kundalini, of the body's spiritual energies, of the flow of energies within, the circulation of energies within, the feeling of surrender to God, the feeling and experience of knowing the life force within. These just don't happen for Ramana or Robert. Or if they do happen, they're not mentioned as being important, because those on the path of Advaita consider that to be illusion, just as Zen people consider all phenomena to be illusory. But what Shankarananda's book pointed out to me so clearly was that in order to make spiritual progress, you absolutely, desperately need a true teacher, a guru. And you need to practice with that teacher. I didn't run into Robert until 1989. Before that, for 20 years, I was involved in Zen and studied under many different teachers, but none of them was my teacher. When I ran into Shankarananda in 1978, he was not my teacher. Muktananda was not my teacher. I wasn't ready or ripe for that kind of opening, the Shaktipat opening. I was ripe for a different kind, the kind that Robert gave me many years later. But those 20 years prior to running into Robert and having an awakening experience and having studied under 6 different Zen teachers and other teachers, many other teachers, because in California at that time all the teachers were coming, including the Dalai Lama, Shakya Tenzing, head of the Shakya sect. Who was the other ones? Oh, so many of them were coming through at that time. Buddhists and Hindus. But to me it was like entertainment. My real practice was being by myself and trying to figure things out. And I made absolutely no progress during that period of time. I had many experiences, but nothing gelled. It wasn't until I met Robert and settled down that things gelled. The same with Shankarananda. His story is his relationship with Muktananda, and how the other teachers he met were there as entertainment. But it wasn't until he went to his guru, he found his guru and settled down in relationship to that guru, surrendering to that guru, obeying that guru, that he grew. And I didn't grow or develop spiritually until I ran into Robert, and I surrendered to Robert. Before that, I was just fanning the flames inside of desire to know. So this is my point to make today. I get many emails and inquiries on Facebook asking me the same questions over and over and over and over again. It's as if no one has ever read anything I've put on Facebook, my blog, or my website. The same questions everyone asks over and over and over again. And I tell people they have to do their homework. They at least should become familiar with what I'm talking about or Robert's talking about before they ask a question that's answered everywhere 1,000 times. So many people come and they start asking questions on Facebook or by email, and I tell them to slow down, you know. They want to know like the quickest way to enlightenment, the fastest method to enlightenment, or else they give me all of their experiences and ask me what they mean. Is this enlightenment? Is that enlightenment? Is this experience enlightenment? Altogether, there's a total focus on correct teachings, correct experiences, and is that enlightenment or not? People are captured by the word enlightenment. Instead, I'd like to propose, and I have done this over and over again, to use the term self-realization instead of enlightenment. Consider enlightenment a garbage term. It varies depending on the tradition you're in. Enlightenment for Robert is different from enlightenment of Muktananda. If you saw either teacher side by side, Robert next to Muktananda, you would see that there's two completely different personalities, two completely different attainments. Robert was quiet as a church mouse. He wasn't the center of attention. He had a fixed gaze, mostly inside. He was not of this world. He was entirely beyond this world, into the selfless self within. On the other hand, Muktananda was, you might say, explosive, totally in the present, filled with humor, filled with energy, filled with sexuality, filled with just irrepressible energy, a sparking constantly, the center of attention. He made the whole room, the whole hall of 1,000 people, just wrapped in attention to see what he's going to say or do next. Just by seeing the polar opposites that they were, you would understand that the path that they taught was very different. Matter of fact, Robert was with Muktananda. And Muktananda said, this is the story at least, to Robert, why don't you join me and we'll build ashrams all over the world? And he said, no, I'm not interested. But that was the personality, like. Muktananda was an extrovert, wanting to help everybody, the whole world. And Robert was private and didn't want to be bothered, and only wanted 10 people that were close to him that could get his teachings. So, beginners think all masters are the same. They have the same teachings, the same enlightenment, the same realization. But it's not true. They're vastly different. And you have to choose based on where you are and how you experience any possible teacher. But it is really, really important that you find a teacher that best suits you and stay there. But you'll find, no matter what your intention is, when you're with a teacher, you may not be able to stay. Shakti, the energy, will push you away. Or, no matter how much you've found one teacher to be helpful, something happens and pushes you apart. It's just like romantic relationships. They may be everything in the moment and for a year or two, but then something pushes you away. It's the pushing away part that you have to fight. Now, you might say Janet was my Shaktipat guru. She kindled my heart's flame with her flame, with her energies, with her devotion towards me. But she couldn't hold it. She couldn't endure the amount of love we had for each other. And she went away. And after me, there was been a whole succession of gurus, one after another. She'd last 1 year, maybe 14 months or 16 months, each time with a different teacher, madly in love with that teacher. And each time she would leave, sometimes by her own need, sometimes she was pushed out. She was incapable of total surrender and staying in that surrendered place. So she's gotten nowhere. She repeats the same pattern over and over again. She can't settle down. And this is the big story. No matter how big her opening was, she lost it because she couldn't stay. She couldn't see the deepening of the relationship all the way through and work on herself, what that relationship was doing to her heart and to her mind. Something frightened her, or something seemed wrong. But she must see her own pattern, but apparently not. She just keeps going from teacher to teacher. On the other hand, I'm pretty sure that today we have Dia listening in under an assumed name or as a guest. Dia is a bird of a different sort. You might say Dia was initiated by her father and her love for her father. And when her father died, her pursuit of her father in her heart led her into exploring different worlds, different psychic worlds. You might say generally term would be for that, I forget what they call that, subtle body worlds, where you travel, astral worlds. Astral is a bad term though. What is revealed is different dimensions, different realities. Much like the scientists talk about the different planes of existence, intersecting planes of alternative worlds. I saw an excellent movie yesterday called Doctor Strange. I highly recommend it. It gives you a taste of interdimensional existence and penetration and magic. Anybody who wanted to know this world would have to know Dia. She's an explorer extraordinaire in this world, in this way. But such world exploring is not necessarily spiritual when it comes vis-a-vis the path to self-knowledge, of self-realization. It can become very unstable, this astral worlds, and hard to find the self that is exploring all of these astral worlds. So if you want self-realization, you have to steady down. Come to one teacher, a Robert, a Nisargadatta. And it can be a book teacher like Nisargadatta or Robert. You just hang on to his transcripts over and over and over and over again until a real-life guru appears out of this tenacious hanging on to one teacher. But those who go from teacher to teacher are lost, are utterly lost. No two Zen teachers are alike. No two Zen masters are alike. The way they teach is different. What they teach is different. The way they teach the method of meditation is different. The way they teach koans, if they use koans, is different. Everything is different. So that's the teaching of the day. Without a commitment to a teacher, a single teacher, your teacher, you will be utterly lost, going from flower to flower, like a butterfly or any other insect that seeks nectar. Because all nectar will be the same. And you'll go from one flower where it seems sweet, and then after a while you say, I want something more sour, and you go to a different teacher. There is no progress in that kind of sadhana. What you are doing is accumulating experiences and intellectual knowledge about what spirituality is like and what you are about. You add experience after experience, and this accumulates into an ice pack, a thick ice pack of knowledge about what spirituality is and about what you are. But there's no real penetration into deeper aspects of yourself. By now, Janet is an expert in all things spiritual, because every time I've talked to her in the years since then, she sounds more and more knowledgeable, more and more experienced, but the same lost person. As I was lost before I ran into Robert, as Shankarananda was lost before he ran into Muktananda. Even for 2 years prior or after meeting Robert, I wasn't really committed to him totally. But somewhere in the middle, around 2.5 years, I gave up, stopped evaluating, stopped criticizing, stopped being ambivalent towards acceptance of him as my teacher. And I just gave up. I surrendered to him. What he wanted, I wanted. When he wanted something, I gave it to him. When he needed money, I gave it to him. When he needed somebody to write something for him, to do an inquiry, or to get articles together for somebody else to write about him, I did it. Without thinking. As quickly as I could. When he asked for 10,000, I gave him 7,000. I cheated a little. Shankarananda had his doubts about Muktananda too. But at some point, relatively early, he realized that Baba was the real thing. Muktananda was the real thing. And he surrendered to him totally, became totally devoted to him. Followed Baba's every whim. Tells a very interesting story where Baba's on a real world tour, and Shankarananda was at his ashram that he had founded in Michigan, Ann Arbor. And there was somebody else, another disciple that was there with Shankarananda in Michigan, who had an airplane and was a pilot. And Shankarananda asked Baba, could I go with this disciple in his airplane rather than to drive 12 hours? And Baba told him, no, you drive. Shankarananda was upset. And but Baba also said, tell this guy with the plane to take a pilot with him. It turns out that the fellow with the plane that Shankarananda wanted to ride in to go to New York from Ann Arbor had a massive heart attack in the middle of the flight to New York. And the other pilot had to take over and land the plane. And that first pilot, the one who owned the plane, nearly died. Took a long time to recover. Had Shankarananda been in that plane with the man who had the heart attack, they both would have died. Shankarananda knew nothing about flying a plane. This kind of thing happens when you're associated with a guru. The synchronicities happen. The magic happens. It happened with me and Robert. It happened with Shankarananda and Baba Muktananda. It doesn't happen when you're not associated with a guru, with a lineage, with a tradition. And almost everybody I know that comes here to this satsang hasn't had a real guru in their life. They don't know what to ask for. They don't know what to look for. They've been trying to do it all themselves by reading books and practicing by themselves, like I did before I ran into Robert. Reading Ramana, practicing Who Am I meditation, self-inquiry, or abidance in the self-inquiry. Or they read Langford and they try becoming aware of awareness itself, finding pure awareness. But all of that is bullshit. It's just misses the point entirely. Teachers use words not as truth, but as encouragements and as probes to help you go the right way. Because the truth is ineffable. And that's why I had people read the transcript 148. What are they talking about? What is he talking about? Well, this should be spent a whole talk on in itself. The final truth, so to speak. It's a state where you disappear. And by that I mean you, as a person, as an I, as a focal point, as a center, disappears. There's no Spencer anymore. There's no Leopold anymore. There's no Max anymore. There's no identity anymore. And when there's no identity, there's nothing opposed to the identity. There's no experienced object because there's just a totality now. There's no I and thou. There's no Max and Max's job. No Max and Max's bed. Robert would often call this state silence, and what he meant by it was it's the gap state when you first wake up in the morning and before the I comes into your consciousness and you realize you have awakened body and mind into the world. That's the gap, the totally still mind, where there's no knowledge, no enlightenment, no world, no justice, no injustice, no life or death. All of these are just concepts. And you exist prior to I am. And you might say it's pure consciousness, but that's to label the state. And being in that state doesn't give you any knowledge. It's after you leave the state that the knowledge comes. But getting into that state is the hard part. You can do it by becoming very quiet and going into yourself deeper and deeper and dropping from your mind into your heart. Or you can do it by being around a spiritual teacher who quiets your mind, and you go deep within into utter bliss and a deepening peace until even that consciousness leaves of being peaceful, of being a person that feels peace. Then there's just peace, and it's no longer happening to you because you don't exist anymore. It's difficult to describe this ineffable. But it does require one thing, and that is to be close to a teacher of self-realization. Now, I talk to Jan Essman every now and then. Jan is a Kundalini teacher. His whole life has been devoted to devotion and surrender to one teacher after another, learning from the teacher, and practicing different kinds of Kundalini, pranayama, and visualizations that awakened the Kundalini in him, traveled up his spine, and sustained in the brain and above. He had a video up where he talks about being in Sahaj Samadhi. He knows all the terms, all the Indian terms, and every nuance of Hindu spirituality, from Sankhya to Advaita to Kashmir Shaivism. Very knowledgeable guy, and he gives Shaktipat at a distance too. But, and I highly recommend anybody in Europe, if they want a teacher, to try him out. I mean, he affects some people negatively, and that of course they can't be with him. But others find his influence positive, and he certainly can teach how to awaken the Kundalini, and he could do it just with touch, with Shaktipat, for those who are ready. But there isn't the emphasis on transcendence as there is with Robert and with Nisargadatta, that the body is unreal, that the world is unreal, that the teachings are unreal, that the reality lies getting before that I am consciousness. If you talk to Jan, he'll say there's no longer any identification in him. He's not identified with a body. He's not identified with anything. Identity is lost, and he's in bliss or in peace, or he plays with the apparent person he is. That's another story. I won't go into that. But what I wanted to leave you with today was Shankarananda's autobiography, at least through 1980, and his relationship with Muktananda before Muktananda died, tells a very important story, has a very important teaching, which is you are nothing until you surrender to a guru, whether it's a living guru or a dead guru. You have to learn how to surrender. You have to learn to let go of all concepts except what is being taught to you in the moment and the decisions that are made in your life. I know nobody can ask questions. Very few can write. I don't know whether anybody can write. I guess they can, but if there's any, do you need a living teacher? Sukai asks, yes, you do. I mean, it really helps. You could use a dead teacher, but almost all benefit flows through a living teacher. Sukai also asks, why can't you do it alone? If you try to do it alone, you're depending on your own ignorance to guide you to awakening and to spiritual intelligence. It's like trying to learn how to play tennis or golf without taking any lessons. To be a professional tennis player or a golfer, you need to take many lessons from a good teacher until you perfect your own game. Also, like a photographer, you know, somebody's writing something that's pretty funny. Photography is a very complicated subject to learn. There's so much you have to master to be a good photographer. You have to know about light. You have to know about the morning light, the afternoon light, twilight, on the sunset, and night light. Each of those kinds of light has a different impact on the scene that you're looking at in terms of colors, shadows. Everything changes. What would be a good shot at 6 a.m. would be a terrible shot at noon. Not only do you have to know light, you have to know perspective. The relationship between the foreground and the background, and parts of the background, how they relate to each other. Perspective. What perspective? Are you looking from the perspective of being a bug on the ground, or from waist high, handheld high camera, or eye hide? Most importantly is composition and color. Composing a photograph is very, very difficult. It has to have the proper balance, it has to have a center of focus of the whole shot, and it has to be put in a certain place within the frame in order to bring one's attention to that focal point. There's negative space, there's positive space, and then there's color. The colors that are there, are they vivid or are they pastel-like? All of these things you have to know, and then even more so, you have to know your equipment. You have to know what your lenses do, whether they're a fast lens with a big opening or a slow lens, whether they're a zoom lens that goes between 70 and 300, or they're a prime lens that's one fixed millimeter in length, like 105 millimeters or 300. And the camera will interpret a scene differently than your vision does, and you have to know how your camera body is different in order to make the photograph for the viewing public, who will view it not as you see it, but as you capture it through your camera's idiosyncrasies. So becoming a good photographer is a long, long time in coming. And that's the way it is with person studying themselves or studying some other spiritual path. You can't do it without a teacher. Somebody who's been there, that understands perspective, that understands color, that understands light, that understands what the camera does, that understands composition, that understands what kind of lens you need and in what situation, how the photographer needs to learn how to blend into the background or get into a bird blind so that he can photograph birds close up, or whether he has to round up a wedding group to getting him to pose, or whether you're a street photographer just going from scene to scene and taking snapshots as interesting subject matter comes up. How do you think a photographer learns all this? Usually they learn it, well, they can learn lots of it from books and manuals, But most of the good photographers, especially the good nature photographers, take workshops. They go to masters and they stay with those teachers for a long time. There are master photographers who give workshops 3 or 4 or 5, 6 times a year, wherein you learn how to photograph. They take you to places. They show you where to set your camera, what lens to use, tell you about the light and how that's changing and what's the proper time to take the photograph. And in this way, by doing, you learn photography and you master photography. It's the same as golf. You play with a pro, and as you play with the pro, he tells you how to do your shot, why you take what iron you do, what club you do, how you play it soft or a hard stroke in order to get the distance you want, or the loft and the angle of fall of the ball so it stops and rolls, or hits and back rolls. All these nuances are necessary in order to master the game of photography or of golf or of chess. And sure, there are self-taught chess masters, but they do so after studying thousands of games of prior masters. There are self-taught golfers, but I don't think any of them are on the circuit, because golf is, along with any physical sport, takes an expert trainer. And if you think you can do it yourself, you're just fooling yourself. You are blind to the need of subservience to a master. You think you can do it yourself is the biggest arrogance you can have. To think you are so hot and so gifted or so frightened of dependency that you want to do it all by yourself. It's a big ego that wants to depend only on itself and not fear becoming dissolved in a relationship with another, a master. Americans, a lot of Westerners, but Americans especially, never want to surrender. That's why there's so much divorce in America, because people don't want to be a unit. They want to be individuals. There's a desire to be separate, to be safe from the kind of disappearance that can happen in the spiritual relationship with a guru or in relationship with another human being in a love relationship. Padma says, the issue is that I don't care about Kundalini, Shaktipat, Kriyas, etc., but the paradox, I'm boring. How to surrender totally to a D? I don't know what D means, but how do you mean, how do you surrender? You just do it. You'll feel it in you. You'll feel that resistance to surrender. And you have to work your way through it. Sometimes a person comes along and the surrender just happens. As Janet came along and I surrendered to her. Totally. She thought she surrendered totally to me. But after a while she found out she wasn't able to surrender totally to me. And she's gone to teacher after teacher, going through the same game each time, taking a year or two each time with each teacher, and going nowhere, except building up more and more experiences. So now she's an expert at dumping gurus, but not a master of herself. She's very educated now in the ins and outs of a relationship with a guru. But without that surrender, there's no surrender to one's deeper self. There's no self-realization. Is there any other questions that can people type out or ask? Anyway, I've said my part. I can't wait for Shankarananda's book to be published. Probably at least 6 months. self-published perhaps by his own organization. And you can read it for yourself, what he went through with his teacher, just like I talk about what I went through with Robert on my website. Yes, you need, Sukai, a living teacher. Yes, you do. Why do you ask that question? Why do you ask that question? Is it because you don't want to surrender, or you don't want to look for a teacher? You know, you have to decide for yourself how much self-realization or any of the other paths mean to you. For me, it was everything. I dropped everything. I dropped out of a PhD program in economics at Wayne State University. I dropped out of a well-paying job. I dropped out of society. It was so phony, I couldn't take it anymore. And I went to the desert to practice meditation in the middle of the desert. Well, I found out that it's hard to meditate when it's 114 degrees in the shade in the desert. And after that, I went to Philip Keplow's center in Rochester, New York, and began my Zen career. But yes, you have to, okay, will the teacher appear when the student is ready? Well, what if the student is never ready? Be calm. How is the student going to get ready except by being with the teacher? What kind of maturation can take place when the deluded is leading the deluded? And just reading and gaining concepts which don't penetrate any deeper than the mind. Something can happen to you before you get a teacher to make you ready, like a love affair or some catastrophic happening in your life that changes your perspective. I also, my father died when I was 14. His death came so suddenly, so catastrophically, when he was out of town. He was a pilot too. He was in New York, died of a massive heart attack. His death nearly destroyed me. It was nearly fatally catastrophic to the development of my sense of self as a person, as a human. I knew then that if my mother had died, it would totally destroy me, because I was far, far, far closer to my mother than to my father, who I almost hated. Fortunately, my mother has lived all 75 years of my life and is approaching her 100th year in October. She now has some illnesses, but I still feel, in a way, that I want to avoid her death and what it will do to me. Because of that, I look back and see why I pursued Zen and the way of Robert and Ramana as an escape from death. Shankarananda didn't lose his parents until late in life, so he didn't have that experience that led him into escaping death through self-realization that takes you to a deeper self that is beyond the personal, beyond the human. Shankarananda instead ran to a teacher who was ebullient, alive, happy, friendly, radiating energy, and only now is facing death himself, and also has gone into the other end of the philosophies where I started. So you can mature spiritually by some catastrophic experience like that, of having somebody close to you die, or a breakup of a very close relationship, loss of a relationship. that will mature you. But it is so difficult to do without a teacher. Like I said, I wandered for 20 some years before I ran into Robert, making mistake after mistake and getting nowhere. Shankarananda was very lucky to have found his own true guru very early in his sadhana, because he wasn't sensitized to death. Oh, now you can hear me better?
Yeah, it made a big difference.
Okay. Well, now that it's made a big difference and I've found the perfect place I've got to go, you've had enough of me. Nobody can ask questions except Spencer and Sukai and Padma, I guess. So I'll bid you adieu until next week at the same time and the same place, and maybe we'll talk more about the transcript 148. But finishing Shankarananda's autobiography yesterday made a big impact on me, and I wanted to talk about relationship with the teacher instead. So, I love you all. I love you as you are. And you need to learn to love yourself that way too. That is so important for self-realization, to be able to just be with yourself, to just be, accept yourself, to love yourself, even if you don't know what the self is, to always direct love towards your innerness, acceptance towards your innerness, whatever is inside of you, to love it and to be it. Now, Spencer says, where's this transcript at? It's at robert-adams.info. robert-adams.info. And it's the transcript there. It's 2,300 pages long. It's on page 1590 is where it starts. Spencer, on the Nisargadatta and Robert Adams Facebook group, I think he posted about it. Yeah, I gave the directions there. On the Facebook pages, the website is listed, and you can just click on it there. So I love you, and I leave you now. Take care, beloveds. See you next week. Same time, same place. Bye.